WLFE DB Radio.
Are you ready?
Live from the Metal Mayhem Studios in Rochester, New York.
We are go.
And heard around the world by metalheads just like you. This is Metal Mayhem ROC.
Heavy metal music.
Your weekly dose of metal music, interviews, album reviews, news, and more. Want to be part of the show? Send us a message through our website, metalmayhemroc.com, or hit us up on Facebook and Twitter. Search Metal Mayhem ROC.
It's getting nice and heavy.
And now, welcome tonight's host, Jon the Vernomatic Verno.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to 2022. Happy New Year to all. Hope everyone's doing all right, safe, sound, and enjoying the new year. I'm the Vernomatic, and this is Metal Mayhem ROC, the podcast. And I'm a little bit under the weather tonight. Not so much COVID or anything, just it's winter. I look out the window of the Metal Mayhem ROC studios. The wind's blowing, the snow's up, and it's January. But tonight, we're celebrating the new year with a continuing episode of our History of Metal series. Ian O'Rourke and Metal Walt, two guys that helped me out. They're part of the team. We've been doing this series. They're going to join me in a little bit, and tonight we are doing the year 1982. Great year. Again, the 80s is the golden age of metal. And in 1982, you had releases like, Ozzy and Sabbath, separate live albums at Live Evil and Speak of the Devil. Judas Priest and Iron Maiden were releasing their landmark albums, Screaming for Vengeance, Number of the Beast. The German guys, Scorpions and Accept, had that Blackout, and Restless and Wild. You get where I'm going with this. 1982 is a fantastic year, so I'm going to be joining Metal Walt and Ian O'Rourke from the band MOTORLORD in just a minute. They're on hold, and we'll get to them. Just want to remind you to visit the Metal Mayhem ROC website. There you'll find direct links to Spotify, Apple Podcast, all the usual streaming links. While you're there, download some past episodes. Just recently, we had the History of Metal 81 a couple weeks ago. Frank Bello of Anthrax was on in December talking about his new book. And go back to November, we had a remote show with the guys from Raven. So all that's available at the site. We invite you to sign up for our email list. This is a way for us to stay in touch with you with emails on new releases, show notifications, and whatnot. Big announcement, I have joined forces with Metal Devastation Radio. They're the new home of the Metal Mayhem ROC live radio show that I do on Monday nights. I'm taking a little 2-week break to regroup. The show does debut on Metal Devastation Radio Monday, January 17th. So again, go to the website. There's tons of information there. And we also just want to remind you about our media partners. Metal Mark James, good friend of the show. He hosts 2 kick-ass shows on the weekends. Metal Mark's Vault on Friday nights, specializing in rare and classic metal. And he regroups and comes back for Saturday night, Metal Mark's Audio Aggression. There, he's concentrating on new and current releases of our classic bands and new bands. Does a real good job on both these shows, so I invite you to, again, go to the website and get all the information and support our media partners. And finally, I'm asking the listeners, if you're listening to this and you enjoy what we're doing, give us a rate and a review. If you're on Apple Podcast, you could do that on the Apple Podcast app. Otherwise, you could go to podchaser.com. It's real easy. Go to the search box and put Metal Mayhem ROC. And again, rate the episode, review, subscribe. That kind of stuff does help the bottom line of the show. So let's get the 80s really rolling. Let's visit 1982. Live from New Jersey, Metal Mayhem ROC correspondent Metal Walt. Hey, Walt, how you doing, man? How are things?
I'm good. Things are well. Good to be back. Good to hear from you guys. And happy to hear we're doing 82. Hope the listeners enjoy it just as well.
Hey, what's going on there, Verno and Walt? Looking forward to another great show here on the History of Metal.
Hey, Ian, how are you, man?
Yeah, I'm doing well, brother.
Good. So, Walt, kick this off. Let's get going.
Okay, 1982. It was yet another year with an overabundance of metal and hard rock releases. This would be year 3 of what was really the biggest decade ever for this genre of music, of heavy metal and hard rock. And in just eyeballing it, there were at least, if not more, 60 releases from known bands, and probably more if you sort of expand it out even into the more straight-ahead rock artists. So, as always, we try to cover as much as we can through this History of Metal series, but I think it's getting to the point where it's going to be very, very hard to stay with the same structure. So we've gotten a little creative, and this time around we're going to add a new flavor to the format. So the episodes for today and go forward is we're going to break them down into categories, and we hope that you as the listeners can appreciate the categories and that we can cover a little bit more content than we normally would. So just to give you a preview of what's going to come, I'm going to kick it off with a little introduction on, let's say, what's going on in North America between the bands from the U.S. and Canada. Verno and Ian will cover a sort of a category called, we'll call it the new wave of British heavy metal, also with some harder bands in there sprinkled in, also with some other new metal releases. We'll then come back to what we're categorizing as the honorable mentions. We have a lot of bands there to cover. And then we'll go into the live album segment because there's several important ones in 1982. And then finally, we'll finish it off with what we'll now call the bands and albums that had the biggest impact in 1982. And we'll have a little debate where it's appropriate, and we'll make sure we'll cover all of the highs and lows of those bands or those releases. Okay, so that's going to be the new format go forward. So I'm going to kick it off, and we're going to get right into it with the U.S. grouping. Okay, so my first one I'm going to cover is Y&T. They released in 1982 the album Black Tiger. Personally, this is a favorite of mine. I think this is, their fourth release in by the band, and there's absolutely no filler on this album. It's just full of well-known songs. I mean, you're talking the title track, songs like Hell and High Water, Open Fire, Forever, Winds of Change, Barroom Boogie. I mean, just a killer album all the way through. When I look at this album and I think of the band now, here it is 40 years later in 2021, albeit it's a different sort of lineup, but Y&T still to this day covers and plays much of this album on their live shows. So a great release there. Night Ranger released Dawn Patrol. This was their debut. Of course, we know Jack Blades, Kelly Keagy, Jeff Watson, and Brad Gillis. Ironically, Brad Gillis will pop up later as we talk a little bit about the Ozzy live album, Speak of the Devil, in which he was part of that, the live recording. And again, this is an album that really put the band on the map in the U.S., and it was really the start of what would be a very, very successful career for them, let's say for the next 3 or 4, 5 years. I mean, it has staples such as Don't Tell Me You Love Me, Sing Me Away, and Eddie's Coming Out Tonight, and of course the actual song called Night Ranger. So really good, strong release there. Sammy Hagar released Three Lock Box. This album actually did very, very well for the times. It ranked in at number 17 in the U.S. Billboard charts. And this was a time where Sammy was really sort of at that sweet spot of his solo career. He was an arena act in certain parts of North America, not all over the country. He was not as popular in the West Coast and the East Coast, but he was an arena performer in the Midwest and down to that belt towards St. Louis. Of course, the title track is a very well-known song, and then he had sort of the popish, My Love Is Driving Me Crazy, which I think got a lot of airplay around that time too. I think one of the cool things about this album was the actual cover itself, because it shows Sammy kind of ripping on his guitar, bent over, and he's inside what would be these kind of giant, sexy red lips of a girl. So a very, very cool image on that one. Moving along, Aerosmith releases Rockin' a Hard Place. Now, what's interesting on this album is this is a release that does not include both Joe Perry and Brad Whitford. Jimmy Crespo, who had joined on the prior album, plays the main guitars here. And if I could be a little bit critical here, I think really, although we do get a generally good rock album here, the band chemistry that those guys had, Perry and Steven Tyler and Brad Whitford, was just missing. And of course, Steven was probably amidst that low point of his drug era. So again, you get a solid release, but nothing that you're ever going to look back upon with any memories. Although, I think the one track that kind of stands out was the song Lightning Strikes. Covering a few more before we move on, Riot released Restless Breed. This was the album in which Guy Speranza exited the band, and they brought in Rhett Forrester as the new singer. Again, an okay release. I think the best track there, known to the listeners, would be Hard Lovin' Man. And then you had Aldo Nova releasing the self-titled band, Aldo Nova being the artist out of Canada. And this is an important one to call out because although this was their debut release, the song Fantasy, which I think most listeners will know, and if they think back to radio and MTV airplay, this song was on every hour on the hour on MTV in 1982. And this was really what I see as maybe the start of that pop metal genre, which of course turned into that term hair metal within a couple of years. And I really think you saw the origins of it come out, especially with the song Fantasy and some of the other stuff on the material. And it was such a big album that I actually charted at number 8 in the US. And to think about Aldo Nova is really, after this, you really didn't hear much about him after that, but what an impact he had that year. And then I'll finish off the segment with the last band, and that's Cheap Trick. Cheap Trick released the album One on One. Again, this was another band in flux. Tom Peterson, the bassist, the longtime bassist, was out. John Brandt came in to the mix. They also brought Roy Thomas Baker of the famed Queen, who did a lot of producing for them in the past. He came in and produced this album. It's got that typical 80s album cover where it kind of looks like somebody took a collage out of a magazine and cut out the 4 members of the band and pasted them with some tape and glue onto a piece of cardboard. So it's definitely a sign of the times when you look at it. And it had a couple cool songs on there. I think the song If You Want My Love, You Got It, that was a good one. And then, of course, my favorite from that album was the song She's Tight, which, again, was another song that got a lot of airplay on MTV. Little personal note to that song. I think that was, as a 12-year-old boy, I was very intrigued with what the phrase She's Tight really meant. And I do remember my parents being a little uncomfortable with me watching that video around the time. So we'll leave it on that note. And, of course, there were many, many other releases in the U.S. by a lot of other bands. Do your research, look it out there. But I think this was what we wanted to cover today. So I hope you enjoyed that bit. Guys, I'm going to turn it over to you for the next category.
Couple quick notes on that. Night Ranger, that Dawn Patrol, they teamed up with Kiss on that famous Dawn Patrol and Creatures of the Night, and we'll cover Kiss a little later. Spot on, Walt, with that Aerosmith assessment. Saw the tour back in the day. They were a mess. That album was pretty cool, though. Bolivian Ragamuffin, Lightning Strikes. There's a couple other ones on there. I liked the album. It did have a fun vibe. And Aldo Nova, again, like you said, the beginning of the MTV, what was that song? Life is Like a Fantasy. Dude's probably still getting a couple royalty checks now and again. Ian and I, we're going to jump across the pond and we're going to visit the new wave of British heavy metal movement. Some of those bands were the pioneer bands that a lot of the 80 mega bands took their inspiration from. Let's see, Witchfinder General, doom metal, 3-piece band from England, released their debut album in 1982, Death Penalty. The album received some criticism for the album cover, which featured a topless model. The album was released as an LP and a picture disc, which gained international import notoriety. You got a naked girl on there, and I remember, just like Walt has his memories of adolescent excitement, I remember getting this album and, looking at it a lot. Let's see what else we have over there. Motorhead. Saw their fifth album, Iron Fist, come out. This was the follow-up to the live album, No Sleep Till Hammersmith. At the time, the band was getting a lot of commercial success. They're gaining a lot of notoriety, but they're also drinking a lot of beers and a couple other substances. So when they went in the studio to do Iron Fist, Lemmy said when he sobered up and realized that the album was fucking garbage, quoting him. Later in the tour, after when they're ending the Iron Fist tour in America, shit hit the fan and Fast Eddie Clarke finally left the band and was replaced by Brian Robertson of Thin Lizzy fame. Actually, Lemmy has gone on to say that if Fast Eddie didn't leave at that point, the Motorhead would have just fizzled out. So thank God that Motorhead broke up, if you will. And Raven came out with the album Wiped Out. Raven was one of those bands that propelled that new wave of British heavy metal, three-piece band. And Wiped Out had, killer tracks on it, the title track, Star Wars, great album cover, symbolism of that new wave of British heavy metal. Ian, what do you got? You got a whole bunch of new ones, too. What do you have?
Well, a personal favorite of mine that comes from our Danish friends in Merciful Fate is the release of their EP, otherwise known as Nuns Have No Fun, in November of '82. This is noted along with the next album that I'm going to mention as probably the footstone for black metal, as it would come to be known years later. Still a very powerful, solid heavy metal album. It's got, elements of new wave of British heavy metal, elements of speed metal, elements of just, classic heavy doominess. I think a lot of the black metal aspect of it comes down to the production, the very lo-fi, simplistic, not overly done, overly produced, but still really some great material. If I had to pick a favorite from their A Corpse Without a Soul is a great song. They did re-release that years later on a Merciful Fate / King Diamond mashup. They did probably have done it a million times, Dangerous Meeting and then Return of the Vampire. The next band, Venom, released black metal, November of '82, same time. And this again being that birth, of that, black metal-ish and, part of that new wave of British heavy metal sound. And they were another one of those bands, it's kind of like with the thrash bands in the States. When you listen to those NWOBHM bands, they shared a lot of commonalities, but they all had a distinction that was of their own. And I think that the sound that Venom was going for, they wanted to be as abrasive, they wanted to be as obnoxious, they wanted to be as evil sounding as they could. It only goes to show, aside from Judas Priest, Venom is probably one of Kerry King's favorite bands, as he's gone on record and said. Some tracks from this one to definitely check out are the title track, Black Metal, and the Countess Bathory, which is another phenomenal tune. Jumping over here to the States, you got Manowar with Battle Hymns. And this is was released in 1982, produced by Joy DeMeo and Ross the Boss, formerly of Disintegrators. And I have to say that probably just for fun, my favorite song on the album is the song Manowar, because you can really hear in these first couple Manowar albums that influence that Ross the Boss has with that. He's got a lot of that New York punk attitude to his guitar playing, but still brings a lot of heaviness. These guys were, it's really important to note, because they were one of that handful of American bands that were really starting to help develop that core heavy metal sound that was going on in unison with what was going on over in Europe and the UK as well. And one of the last ones I wanted to mention is in San Fran, Brian Slago released Metal Massacres 1 and 2. And the significance, particularly of these albums, is there's some notable bands that have first song releases being put out for the general public. And Slagle had always gone on record saying that he was a huge fan of anything and everything that was hard rock and heavy metal in the scene. The band Steeler, we get the introduction of not only Ron Keel, who would go on to have his own fame in the band Keel later, but that young Swede by the name of Yngwie Malmsteen makes his debut with this band. Rat, with the early incarnation that Stephen Pearcy had put together, has their first single released. And a little band by the name of Metallica scraped an idea together and released the song Hit the Lights before they even had a thought of a band and a set list or anything else. James and Lars got together and cobbed some stuff together with Rodney McGovney and pulled in another guitar player, and his name just flew out of my head, but they put out Hit the Lights. And this is basically the birth of thrash, plain and simple. This is the point right here when thrash basically got started. The second album, you got significant, initial releases by Armored Saint. You got Savage Grace. You got Warlord, Surgical Steel, Trauma, which was Cliff Burton, his first band, had the song Such a Shame on there. And there was a band called Aloha that actually was a metal band with a young Marty Friedman from Hawaii playing guitar on there. And they put their stamp on things. So that's pretty much what I got wrapped up for you here on my part of the list for the new wave of British heavy metal and heavy bands throughout.
Thank you. Thank you. Fun facts. I didn't know that about Marty Friedman. I'm going to have to go back and check that out. That guitarist on the Metallica was Graham Lloyd.
Lloyd, I kept thinking Lloyd something was his first name, but yep, Graham Lloyd, that's right.
Yeah. Fun fact on that Metallica, I think some of the early pressings had double T in the Metallica. There was a misspelling on there. And now just to piggyback on what you're saying on there, some American bands that were part of that, the Rods, that came around with their album in 1982, Wild Dogs. And right now we're going to take caught up with Carl Kennedy. He's going to tell us exactly how they got the title Wild Dogs, exclusively here on Metal Mayhem ROC, the history of metal. So 1982 saw Wild Dogs. What can you tell us about the Wild Dogs release?
Wild Dogs, well, I can tell you that when I first started writing that song, I was living in this place I called The Nest, and it was way back in the woods, and there was nothing around, but it was great because you could play as loud as you wanted in the middle of the night and didn't bother anyone. So there were some dogs. There were 3 dogs that were running around, and so I would pick up my guitar every day, and I would just write riffs and record them. And I was watching these 3 dogs terrorize some little bunny, and so that gave me the title for the idea for the song Wild Dogs. We demoed songs for that album, and then we wound up going to England to record it at Parkgate Studios, and that was crazy. And so we went to Parkgate Studios in January of 82, recorded for 2-3 weeks, something like that, and then we went on the road with Iron Maiden.
It's pretty funny how album titles get their names sometimes. I mean, just to be there, that's pretty awesome.
Yeah, that's taking a peek behind the curtain. That's how the sausage is made. So
yeah, right. Nope. Sometimes you don't want to see it, but a lot of times you want to know what's going on.
Yeah.
One other one that I wanted to make a quick note on too was up in Canada. We love our friends up to the north. Anvil released Metal on Metal, and this is another one of those albums that bands young and old, from Metallica to Pantera and everywhere in between, have gone on note. If anybody saw the Anvil documentary, there's a lot of known musicians that still are in shock that these guys just didn't have that kind of momentum, whether it was look or whatever, to get them going, because they really were making some great stuff. Songs to note on this one: the song Metal on Metal is bitchin', and the instrumental March of the Crabs is probably one of the coolest things to ever be released at the time. It's got this just crazy, intense, driving riff to it. So do yourself a favor and check it out. I am going to send this on over to my buddy Metal Walt, and he is going to get us started with the honorable mentions. Walt?
Thank you, Ian. Before we get into the honorable mentions, a little fact check to add to the first band, Witchfinder General. Did a little research here, and the cover model, actually, her name is Joanna Latham, and she was actually a Playboy bunny. And if you read up on her, that was the reason she was topless, and she was actually Hugh Hefner's girlfriend, living in the Playboy mansion in L.A. during the early 80s. So on that note, we'll move it over to the honorable mentions. So I'm going to cover off on what we previously called the Deep Purple family tree. My first one I'll talk about here is the Whitesnake Saints and Sinner album. Again, this was probably maybe the band heading towards the end of that rock blues style that put them on the map over the last 4 or 5 albums. On this album, you do get an early version of Here I Go Again. Of course, as we all know, it was re-recorded later on and released on that self-titled album in 87, and it became a monster hit. But this is the early version, and it also contains the Whitesnake staple song, Crying in the Rain. This was also an album where the band was in flux. I mean, the original lineup recorded the album, but towards the end of the making of the album, and actually by the time it was released, David Coverdale actually changed band members. Bernie Marsden and Ian Pace were at that point out of Whitesnake, and in came Mel Galley and Cozy Powell on drums. Mel Galley from Trapeze, that is. Okay, so that's Whitesnake. Gillan released the album Magic. Not much detail I will call out here other than that this was Ian Gillan and his solo band's last solo release before basically rejoining Deep Purple in the 1984 year. And actually, he jumps into Black Sabbath for a year in 83 in between. An interesting release that is not talked about very often is the Glenn Hughes Pat Thrall release, the self-titled Hughes Thrall album. And for a while there, Glenn Hughes was kind of putting solo albums out, staying in that kind of funky space. He also had a lot of substances abuse, and I guess this was his return to rock. And it was a shame because the album generally was a good album, and it was meant to be a band. But unfortunately, this band never went ahead and ever released another album after that. But Pat Thrall was a very, very good musician. He came out of the likes of the Pat Travers Band. And on this album, interestingly enough, is Frankie Banali played drums. I asked the listeners to go and just revisit it, pick out some of the tracks. The best hard rockin' song on the album is a song called Muscle and Blood, it really is killer. And you have a nice ballad called The First Step of Love. And then they went and re-recorded the Trapeze song Coast to Coast, which again, Glenn Hughes will admitting to say that he was 17 years old when he joined Trapeze in 1970. And this was actually the first song he ever wrote as a professional artist. So I know it's one dear to his heart. And then kind of rounding out the Deep Purple family tray, we have Rainbow, which released the album Straight Between the Eyes. The cover is one of those, again, great 80s covers where it's sort of a caricature of a man's face. And you kind of see the guitar being smashed right between the skull, right in the forehead, and right between the eyes. And his eyes are kind of bulging out. So definitely some good imagery here. This album was recorded, oddly enough, at Les Studio in Quebec, which was, as we've talked about, the studio where Rush put together a string of about 4 or 5 albums in their kind of peak late 70s, early 80s era. In the band Don Airey of Ozzy Osbourne fame joined Rainbow for this particular album. So he was in for David Rosenthal. And the album did very, very well in North America and the UK. It actually hit number 30 in the US, which is pretty good. And it was actually number 5 in the UK. Again, no surprise, being that Richie Blackmore is a native, guy from England. Some great material on this album. And I think the tracks that most people will know are, the song Stone Cold Power and Death Alley Driver. So again, a really good favorite of mine. I love those Rainbow albums with Joe Lynn Turner. Joe Lynn Turner's a local Jersey guy. He'll always be dear to my heart, and I think that's some good music. Those albums that they did in the early 80s really have withheld the test of time. So that's my little recap of the honorable mentions, and I'll move it back over to you guys again for some additional bands.
Here's some fun facts. Adrian Vandenberg releases his first solo album, 1982. That album had a powered ballad, Burning Heart. I think it got a little MTV play. But Adrian Vandenberg ended up teaming up with David Coverdale and Whitesnake later in the decade. Actually did the guitar solo for Here I Go Again up in 1987 when they redid it for that chart topping. We'll visit that later. More bands coming around. Crocus, their album One Vice at a Time, their 6th studio album at this point. Let's see. They did the cover of The American Woman from the Guess Who. The song Long Stick Goes Boom, which was one of their quote, cult songs, the killer song, gained some notoriety from the Grand Theft Auto Vice City video game series. Oh, and here's another fun fact. Bruce Dickinson in 1982 was on One Vice at a Time, backing vocals on the track I'm on the Run. And Led Zeppelin brought it in for a landing with the album Coda. Basically, they emptied the vaults. This is a contractual album that they owed Atlantic Records for an album and taxes on some money owed earlier. So, like I said, they emptied the vault. These songs were from their entire career. And one song that they did that was closest to that time period was a leftover track called Wearing and Tearing. It was recorded in November 78, and this song was written as a reaction by Jimmy Page to the punk movement and to show that Led Zepp could compete with the newer bands. That was Coda. It sold well. It was the end of the Zeppelin studio albums, if you will. So, Ian, what do you got, buddy? You got the flip side to this. What do you have?
Death Valley Driver! It was stuck in my head, and I had to let it out the entire time after he mentioned it. So Uriah Heep releases their 14th album, Abominog, in March of 82. Anybody that's listened to the show knows that I am a Heep fan. At this time, this is another shifting of the personnel within the band. You know, you still have Mick Box there, but you have Peter Golby comes in as a new vocalist, and John Sinclair on keys, and Lee Kerslake, just coming off from getting sacked from Ozzy Osbourne's band after helping to create not one but 2 fantastic albums, makes his return to the band. This is a album that a lot of people look at and enjoy. You can definitely tell that the influence of the metal movement and the NWOBHM movement that was going on in the UK having a little bit of an influence. The song Too Scared to Run is probably one of my faves on the album. It's really got a killer riff, and Mick Box just goes ahead and rips through some scalar runs in the beginning of it. MSG releases Assault Attack. This is the one and only album with Graham Bonnet on vocals. Martin Birch produced it. Martin is getting a lot of work at this time between the Priests and the Maidens, and now with MSG, and I think he's doing albums for just about everybody under the sun. This has really got some interesting material again. MSG kind of still that extension of UFO. A lot of raging hard rock and metallic moments, a lot of ripping solos, but still a lot of moody bluesy stuff that kind of comes into play. Graham Bonnet really works well in that era because he does a little bit of it all. The song Assault Attack is great, and the instrumental Ulcer is really cool to kind of close out the album. And who was the other one that I had here on my list? Gary Moore, Corridors of Power, released in September of 82. Cool part about this is his friend Ian Pace from Deep Purple and Whitesnake fame, who had played with Gary Moore in Coliseum 2, actually came back and did at least a half dozen or so tracks on the album. You can actually see him in the video for the ballad Always Gonna Love You, that was circulating on MTV at the time with Gary Moore with a very short haircut, probably trying to fit both sides of the spectrum with the new wave stuff that was going on and the heavy metal hard rock thing. And he also does a killer version of the song Wishing Well from the band Free. Between he and the band Blackfoot, the covers of the song, which is a great Free song anyways, just freaking stomps a hole in a lot of other music. It's just a really killer song. So that's what I've got for the honorable mentions. And we're going to jump right over now to the live album segment. And I found it funny because as you go through the list of honorable mentions, and Walt was mentioning, certain acts like, Gillan and, Whitesnake and Rainbow and all these bands that are coming along. Other than the link that Ozzy Osbourne has with being the original Black Sabbath vocalist, the people that have played in and out of the bands with them is an incestuous mix, and even, you start to dabble in, later on with Glenn Hughes, coming into the Deep Purple, from the Deep Purple side of things, and you got Don Airey and blah, 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 blah. But, Bernie Tormey, being Gillan's guitar player, with the band Gillan, and he left to go play, and then you've got, it's just a crazy connection, all these lunatics. Anywho, Speak of the Devil, released in November of '82. This is chock full of famous Black Sabbath covers, and rumor has it, part of the story behind it, or some of the stories behind it, the infancy of this actually had come about when Randy was still alive, when they were touring for Diary of a Madman. Randy was not having it, neither was Tommy Aldridge, and at that point they were ready to go, and Rudy Sarzo was ready to go with them. There was some infighting in the band, and Randy, decided that, he's going to stick things out, but he was kind of at the point where he, when the tour was done and his obligations were complete, he was going to be moving on, and probably the rest of the band would go with him, whether or not they stuck together or did their own thing regardless. So unfortunately, Randy dies. Bernie Tormey ends up coming in the sub for the tour for a handful of shows. At the same time, they had reached out to Brad Gillis, who Walt had mentioned earlier with Night Ranger. Brad Gillis was kind of put on the spot to quickly go through and learn a bunch of Black Sabbath songs, which, even though he had heard them, didn't know much about them. So he borrowed a bunch of albums from some friends and people in the band. They spent some time together, were able to cob things up. The album, being Black Sabbath songs, was a kind of a kick in the ass back to the previous management with Black Sabbath, because now their production hold was off from Ozzy and the boys and Sabbath, and this was a way to get some royalty money back on songs that they had created. They went ahead and recorded nothing but Sabbath songs, and it's not a bad album. Brad Gillis is a killer guitar player, and I think he does a great job with kind of putting a little bit of modern balls behind, even though, you're talking, the father of heavy metal, Tony Iommi. How can you replace him? But he does a good job of coming in, and really, if you get a chance, this is a live album I think you need to check out, especially something coming out in '82, because as we go forward throughout the decade, you see spatterings of them coming out, but nothing like the glory days of the '70s. Well, how about I kick it over to you so you can tell us about the one that you've got on hand?
Yeah, good job, Ian. So I'm going to pick it up in sort of the same vein and talk about Black Sabbath's release, Live Evil. Again, I think there's some parallels here to Speak of the Devil. This was a band that had pressures and perhaps obligations to put another release out, and I think there's a couple pieces that added to this. Similar to Ozzy, I think it was also around Geezer and Tony's desire to not let that publishing of the original material, the Ozzy tracks, end, And they knew by re-recording variations of those songs, which were part of the live show anyway on the Heaven and Hell and Mob Rules tours, that they could really, stand to get some really good royalties continuing on those. So that was one of the reasons for this. And I think it was also done as sort of a rebuttal, fully knowing that Ozzy was putting out his solo album of all Sabbath material. And I know Tony was not happy about that. I think the other piece of it was the record label had put out the album Live at Last, which was an old show from, I believe, 74. It was put out maybe on the original record label Vertigo Records. And it's just a very subpar quality. I think many, many years later, a proper version of that came out as maybe an additional CD added onto a remastering or something, if I recall correctly. But these are all, let's say, moves made outside of the official Sabbath camp that just were perhaps done, not intentionally, but just damaged the brand of Black Sabbath. And I think Tony felt the pressures to do this. When it comes to the album itself, it is a great album. It's full of great songs, a really nice combination of the Ozzy staples as well as the best of the songs from the two Dio albums. It has a killer album cover. I mean, one of my favorites, because it really takes the imagery of all of the characters that are portrayed in the songs on the album, and it appears as if they're kind of walking out of the ocean and onto the beach of sorts, and there's lightning right above them, and you have the Neon Knight leading the pack up the front with the neon sword, and of course you look at the Heaven and Hell, the Angel, the Devil, you have the paranoid guy, you have the voodoo kind of Indian guy in the background kind of walking out of the water, the Mob Rules guy from the cover, and then of course you have the War Pigs pig in army gear, and then full on M16 coming out. So really just good imagery on that album. Unfortunately, I think the quality of the release was overshadowed by what would come in let's say, not in the live recordings, but what happened in the studio. And again, I think there's going to be, two sides to every story, and then there's the truth, and it all falls somewhere in between, as the cliche statement go. But, there were band tensions at that time. I think there was a couple factors here. As Tony and Geese were the one camp, Vinny and Ronnie were the other camp. They were the Americans and the Brits. Tony and Geese were in their substance abuse, coked up all the time. Dio was feeling a little bit more in control of the band. And from, as the legend says, he was becoming a little, bossy in his ways. There was a reference to him. They were saying they were calling him like the little mini Hitler at the time. He also, I think, saw perhaps a sweet deal as a solo artist coming about. Not that he was planning on leaving Black Sabbath, but there was the rumors that he was ready to sign a solo deal, which would come. And I think probably the bigger factor was when they went in to mix the tapes, they didn't do it as a unit. And Tony and Geese apparently didn't show up the day they were supposed to mix because they were hungover, coked up. Ron and Vinny started dabbling at it, just kind of saying, okay, well, we'll get in here and mix it. The other guys never showed up. And when they did show up later on, they were pissed off, saying, well, why did Ron start the mixing? And that created tension. So it was this sort of unspoken kind of tensions that never really got, aired out. And it was really all misunderstandings. So I guess after that was done, Tony put a stand down, and he basically decided, I'm not going to lose control of this band. It's my band. I started this. And he basically asked Ronnie to leave. And Ronnie, I guess at that point, was glad to do so. So, before the album ever really hit the shelves of the stores, the band was over. But nonetheless, you do have a great album, like I said, and definitely a good one. There's some good soloing on there. As I mentioned in a couple previous episodes about Heaven and Hell, you start to see these songs really open up more in a live setting. I think the title track, Heaven and Hell, which also has a Tony solo, and it kind of blends its way into Sign of the Southern Cross, is the highlight for me on that album. So a good one. Both two really good albums from different camps, and both with big stories behind them. So
yeah, both of those albums, I liked both of those. I got them when they both came out. Fun fact on that, Ozzy, there was the tour where he shocked everyone. He shaved his head, and he was had that crew cut. And that Sabbath, the Live Evil thing with that album is I didn't really enjoy the sound of that album. thought it sounded a little muddy, and maybe it had something to do with the mixing ping pong activities that were going on. Who knows? Maybe they screwed everything up. But great job, guys. Let's see. Let's go across the pond and, well, stay across the pond. 2 English bands preceding SAXON. The Eagle Has Landed, their first live album, came out in 1982. It was from the Denim and Leather tour, and it was the first recording featuring new drummer Nigel Glockler. Nigel took over for original drummer Pete Gill, who came down with an ailment, so they brought Nigel in. He got up to speed real quick, and there he was. He finished the tour, and the Denim and Leather tour produced The Eagle Has Landed. So when this album originally came out, it was a single album, single disc, have you, but then later reissues had the tracks that weren't on there. Stuff like And the Bands Played On, See the Light Shining, Dallas 1 p.m., Hungry Years. Those are all great songs, but they weren't on the original release. The album was recorded at the famous Hammersmith Odeon. We're going to take a little break right now, and when we come back, we're going to pay attention to bands that made the most impact in 1982. But first, we're going to hear from Nigel Glockler, and he's going to tell us exactly what it was like taking over for Pete Gill and doing that album. I'm the Vernomatic. This is Metal Mayhem, the history of metal, the year 1982.
Okay, so Denim and Leather tour, yeah. The first gig on that was in my hometown, and I'd actually bought tickets to it. So, and then I ended up playing it. Obviously, I think it was about 2-3 days to learn the whole setting. So that was a bit of a nightmare, but we got through it. And then band said to me, "Oh, by the way, we're recording a live album in about 10 days." And I was like, yikes.
And that ended up being the Eagle Has Landed.
Eagle Has Landed Part 1, yeah.
Beautiful. So at this point, you were taking over for Pete Gill, and you became a permanent member. That's fantastic.
Attention metalheads. Since we launched in 2019, Metal Mayhem ROC has been the go-to source for metalheads to talk about and hear the music they love. We can't thank you enough for being part of the family. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, hit subscribe so you know when we go live. Plus, tell folks why you like to listen when you leave a rating and review. If you're listening on another platform, head over to podchaser.com and type in Metal Mayhem ROC in the search bar. Hit subscribe, then rate the show and leave a comment on why you get your metal fix from the Vernomatic and his guests, Metal Mayhem ROC. Now, back to the show.
Just want to remind you folks about the Metal Mayhem ROC live radio show that yours truly hosts Monday nights, 6 to 9 p.m. Eastern Time on our brand new home, MetalDevastationRadio.com. It's 3 hours of metal. There's a live chat room where you could go in there and send me requests, talk to other bangers from around the globe. It's a real good time. Good chance to meet people and bring your Metal Monday in for a cool landing. You could get direct links right on the MetalMayhemROC.com website. So right now, we're going to end the show with the bands that had the biggest impact in 1982. Have it be their, first monumental album or their big tour or their swan song or whatever. So, Walt, why don't you kick this out? What do you got for us?
All right, so I'm going to talk about Kiss's Creatures of the Night album. This was a band that returned to their rock style of music. I mean, again, you got to remember this is after a period of 5 or 6 years where, they had put out Dynasty, the solo albums, and then the Unmasked album. And it was just a very soft period for them as the band that everybody loved. So this was a return to rock. It was, let's say, a release that was written for the first time as a trio, really just Gene, Paul, and Eric Carr. And although Ace was considered still an official member of the band, for all intent and purposes, he was out of the band. He was truly an alcoholic at this point in time, and he had a bad car accident at that time, and he just was an untrustworthy guy, and he was not consistent, and they kind of just pushed him out of it. He's, again, an official member, but in reality, Bob Kulick played most of the guitar on the album, amongst others. And then, of course, as the recording went on, they brought in the unknown artist Vinnie Vincent, and he came in to kind of play lead and eventually get on the Creatures of the Night tour. It was just a very odd and confusing album because, you know, here you have Ace on the album cover, but Vinnie Vincent's really in the band. And then I think this led to the confusion of maybe why the band was not respected at this point in time. You know, I think overall it's a really solid album. And I think when you think about the title track and even the songs on side 2, I Love It Loud, you know, I Still Love You, and War Machine. I mean, these are all really, really good, strong tracks, and they would be tracks that would be carried forward into that 80s non-makeup era of Kiss that would take them up through about 1990 to 92. These were all staples in their show, and still to this day they record, you know, touring with and playing some of these songs. But truthfully, is I think after this 4 to 5 year absence from stardom, Kiss was not a cool thing anymore. And the album didn't sell very well. And I know from reading articles from back then, the tour was a flop. They would try to get back there and play the hockey arenas, and they were, you know, playing to 5,000 people in a, you know, 20,000 seat arena, that kind of idea. And I think it was a lot of because there was confusion as to who was in the band. I mean, again, everybody going up there expecting to see Ace, and then here comes Vinnie Vincent as a different guitar player, playing a completely different guitar. And he's up there as the Egyptian warrior. And Eric Carr, who this was sort of his first debut to North America, because you have to recall, during the Unmasked album, they never toured America. They did one show at the Palladium in 1980 to kick off the tour, and that was it. They were just toured over in Australia. So he was also kind of an unknown entity. And I think it was just, although the band was not, you know, stale in any means, it was just Kiss were old news by that point in time. And I think it was a good release from a musical point of view, but I think they made the right move the next year when they took the makeup off. And we'll get into that when we talk about the Lick It Up album in 83.
What else we got? Twisted Sister, Under the Blade. Metal Walt, what do you got?
Yep, so Twisted Sister's Under the Blade. This was the debut album from the New York-based band. Interestingly enough, I think this band had been around for 3 or 4 years already, and they were a big staple in that tri-state area, really playing the clubs. They just didn't have a record label at that point in time. So they were already a known entity. They just needed to get their break, and they took a leap of faith, and they moved over to the UK, and they got signed over there. And the album got picked up, and it was produced actually by Pete Way from UFO. So they became sort of an underground hit in the UK, and I know they started their early tours in 82. They actually opened up on the Motorhead tour. So they got on the map over there. Even Fast Eddie Clarke played on the song Tear It Loose. So they were in a good place. Unfortunately, the album really didn't get a fair chance to sell well because the album in the UK, the record company, Secret Records, who were UK-based, kind of just went out of business. And it forced the band to kind of regroup, and then that album was re-released in the US a couple years later. But a little fun fact that was called out in me doing my research was that actually, before the album came out, the record label was looking for an additional track to finish out the album. And as it goes, that the hit song, We're Not Gonna Take It, was actually written and completed, although when they pressured the band to provide the track, Dee Snider had not written the lyrics yet, and they were under this time pressure, so they basically said, screw it, and they couldn't use the track, and then here it is, the track is held over, and we all know what became of that hit and where it's gone all these years later. But I think the album itself, it's an aggressive album, it's a hard rock album, yet there's a lot of melody on it. You know, What You Don't Know Sure Can Hurt You, that was a show opener of theirs, and that sort of 4-pack on the album that ends the album, wherever it is the track Shoot 'Em Down, Destroy Or Under the Blade, and Tear It Loose. These are all just killer hard rock songs. So nothing but good things to say about the Twisted release. So next we'll move over to Accept, Restless and Wild.
Yeah, Restless and Wild, released in October of 82, really is one of the heaviest albums to come out at the time. The lead-off song, Fast as a Shark, which is a personal favorite, is probably one of the fastest double bass playing songs that you are going to hear at the time in 1982. I mean, these guys really just come out blazing. And the production on this album I always thought was great, because the guitars very much like a Judas Priest, and the drums and the bass, everything has its place, but everything is in your face. And then you've got Udo Dirkschneider, singing up over the top and screaming with that, Halfordish, kind of upper register. It gets right in there and digs right at your soul like it's supposed to, and really kind of just puts its stamp on heavy metal at the time coming out of Germany. The next album I want to talk about is my gateway to the band. This is Diver Down by Van Halen, released in April of '82. I had a lot of trepidations about this album. As much as I loved the album, the one connect that I always had with Eddie Van Halen was the fact that there were so many cover tunes on there. And no matter how great of a job that they did, I always will hang my hat on those original material numbers that are on the album. Songs Hang 'em High, Cathedral, Secrets, Little Guitars, The Full Bug. They could have released this as an EP, even adding in the 6th song, Pretty Woman, with the Intruder introduction to it, and probably done just as well. But they did throw on, Dancing in the Streets, Happy Trails obviously closes it out. And, as I mentioned, Pretty Woman. So 1983, you really see just how big Van Halen is. Headlining Yas Festival, playing to 300,000 people. Really the biggest band in the world. Nobody can touch them. So for me to have trepidations about this album, I mean, that's like saying, well, gold is heavy, but gold is gold. Vern, I know you're a big fan.
I like that saying. Gold is heavy, but gold is gold. Yeah, never really thought about it when you just mentioned if they just would have done a EP. And, truth be told, it was almost as long as an EP. Would have 11 songs, but one was Happy Trails, one was Little Guitars, the intro, then one was the Intruder. So they have better albums, but I like it. I still listen to it. All right. So what do you got? Scorpions? You're doing...
Yeah. Scorpions released Blackout in March of '82. And really, I mean, this is probably one of we've talked about it before, when the ascension of the Scorpions, the stuff that they had going on through the '80s. This is another monumental milestone album. Just to call out a couple favorite tracks, you got the lead song, Blackout. You've got Can't Live Without You, which is, was one of the catchiest songs ever written, with the simplest lyrics. And then the song China White. Oh my God. These guys really, really knew how to write some crafty, again, kind of to go back what, Walt had said about Twisted Sister. Yeah, they were a very melodic, very much a hard rock band, but they had these metallic edges and fringes, and the things that they were doing. They really were one of the biggest bands at that time, and then going forward, they just got even bigger. I think we're going to touch on that probably a lot more as we get through the 80s. But I'm going to kick it back over to my friend Walt, because he wants to tell us about our favorite trio from Canada.
Thank you very much, Ian. So I'm going to talk about Rush here and the Signals album. This is the beginning of the next era for us Rush geeks. This was a shift out of the guitars, so to speak, and over to more of a keyboard, heavy synthesizer, and electronic type sound. It was kind of that new era. And they would continue that for the next, this album plus an additional 3, taking them out to the late 80s. What's interesting is how this is no surprise, knowing the band and who they were as professional musicians that had very high standards, is they knew it would have been a very, very easy thing to just go out there and play it safe and follow on the heels of Moving Pictures and basically make a Moving Pictures type part 2. That sounds the same, but they wanted to test themselves, step out of their comfort zone. So what they actually did was, and this is hard to fathom in 2021, they said they came off that rather lengthy Moving Pictures tour, and I believe it was around July of 1981, and they called it what they said. They went on an extended break. The extended break was 3 months. Can you imagine that now in all these years later? They took a 3-month break and then went back out on the road to do a mini tour, let's say during that October through December period. And in that tour, they started dabbling around in rewriting and recording new material in their sound checks. And as I mentioned before, Subdivisions was one of them that was kind of, it was born in the sound checks as well as the song Chemistry. And they actually worked up a very early version of Subdivisions, and that was actually performed live before it was actually out on an album on that mini tour. It's an interesting album because it's kind of a mixed opinions, although I don't think the guitar was really eliminated. It was just foreshadowed by the addition of that electronic feature and the keyboard. So you just added to the sound elements. But what I found interesting on this album is maybe because of, less in-your-face type guitar, I really thought you heard some amazing playing from Geddy. And if you listen to the songs, let's say the outro or the ending part of Countdown, or the whole song, The Digital Man, the beginning, how he's just kind of wailing away in the beginning riff, and then he does that little mini solo in the beginning, and even kind of the kind of cool chords in the song Chemistry. You really listen and you hear Geddy at his best at that point in time, which I think is a real highlight of the album. But overall, I think there's great materials. I mean, everybody knows the song Subdivisions, but when you take all the styles that you hear on the album, I think you see Analog Kid was a very up-tempo rocker, yet Digital Man had kind of that heavy bass, sort of a ska feel and a very funky midsection. New World Man was very overly done melodic, and it had sort of a reggae vibe. And then you had a song like Losing It, which I never really appreciated this track initially until they brought it out, and they only did it, I think, 2 or 3 times on their final R40 tour. I did see him perform it in Madison Square Garden in New York. And this was one that was just sort of a weird, quirky track, but it really featured an electric violin through the whole track. And it wasn't played by the band. It was played by somebody that came in on the outside. And then, of course, the oddball track is the track that ends the album called Countdown, which was all about the NASA experience of the spaceship Columbia leaving out of Cape Canaveral in Florida. And it's just laden with all kinds of videos and sound effects from NASA. And you have towards the end, as the band's jamming out and they fade it out, they bring in sort of the communication from the cockpit. Just a really, really cool album. And I would think that, I really strongly suggest to listeners that either don't know this album or forgot about this album to go out there and give it another listen. You will not be disappointed. This album went number 1 in Canada, number 3 in the UK, number 10 in the US, so it must have done well. So I think a classic Rush album, and I was really proud and happy that I could revisit this one today.
It's Rush, man. There are no rules when it comes to Rush. That trilogy, The Signals, Grace Under Pressure, Power Windows, we'll be visiting those in the next couple of years. What do we got next? Little Priest? Who's doing Priest?
Yep, so Metal Walt here. I'll continue on with Judas Priest. So this is the album Screaming for Vengeance. I think this one is, there's no disagreeing on this album in terms of opinions from the three of us as well as the listeners. But, I'm going to kick it off by talking about the album cover, right? It starts off with what you see on the album. It's the bright colors, which is something we were not used to from Judas Priest. You had the yellow and red called out. You had sort of that melodic monster type eagle landing, just great imagery. I think this was really the band's second commercial breakthrough, but I think it was their biggest breakthrough in the States. I think British Steel was big more from an England point of view. This was really in the States. And of course, it was brought on by massive video play and FM radio play of the song "You Got Another Thing Coming." I mean, who can forget Beavis and Butthead ripping on this video? I remember them very well at the end when the guy kind of gets blown up and his head gets blown off, but his pants fall down. And I just remember, Beavis and Butthead kind of giggling and saying, hey, on top of getting his head blown off, his pants fall down, that kind of thing. So good stuff there. But, and again, another one of these typical stories where that became the monster track on the album. And it was also the last one written and the last one added to the album. It was sort of an late addition to the repertoire. And apparently they had the idea of the song together, but they had to piece it together at the end out of pressures of the record label to add one more song on there. And look where it took the album. But that album goes so much further than that song. Actually, there's that song is the furthest from my favorite on the album. I think the general theme of the album is you see all the elements of Priest at its best. It was heavy. It had fast drumming. It was melodic, and it had Halford every song you just heard the screams everywhere from him. His vocal range, incredible. It was at number 17 in the US, number 11 in the UK, and they now are an arena status band in the States. Like I said, it broke them. I mean, you had bands like Iron Maiden, Crocus, and Uriah Heep supporting them in hockey arenas all the way through 82 and 83. They played and were one of the featured acts in the famed 1983 US Festival out in California. And this was just a great era from the band. And I think of not just You Got Another Thing Coming and Electric Eye, which are kind of the cliche staples, but I can't even call these songs deep tracks, but I guess in a way they are. But, the favorites of mine, Riding on the Wind, Devil's Child, and Bloodstone, and even the title track. I mean, those are just, there's no questioning the impact that this album made. And this is just a must-have metal album. And it's just utterly, one word for it, it's a masterpiece. Case closed.
Yeah, I'm going to agree with you on that, Walt, because this is it goes back and forth between my number one and my number two favorite Priest album of all time. And the one thing that this album shares with the last album that I'm going to speak of is the fact that every song on it is nothing but great. All killer, no filler. I might as well jump right into it. Number one song, last album, we're going to discuss Iron Maiden, Number of the Beast. Released in March of 82. I could go through and say I've got a couple favorite songs on the album for you to listen to, but I think that you probably already know them. And if you don't, you're doing yourself a disservice. Go out and listen to the album, because from beginning to end, this is another one of those classic, excellent, almost to the point of perfect albums. But if I had to give a shout out to a song that maybe doesn't get as much attention, but is always been a favorite of mine, is Children of the Damned. The instrumentation, the way that the riff is played, everything that's going on, the twin leads, there's just so much. And this album from beginning to end is full of it. It really is. This again is that next chapter of Iron Maiden, and this is where you're going to see that ascension, just like with Judas Priest and just like with the Scorpions and a bunch of these other bands, where they're going to start shooting up into the stratosphere and just become some of the biggest bands in the world, period. There's this time period that we're talking about right now was percolating with so much musical magic. It's hard to describe and capture in the shows that we're talking about, but I think that when we get a chance to get in here and throw some of these albums out there for you people to listen to, I think you're going to understand that, I mean, this really is stuff that not only from a nostalgic standpoint for us old headbangers that are doing this stuff, but for anybody new out there, do yourself a favor and go back and check this stuff out and see where everything comes from, everything culminated from, because this is truly magic material right here.
Oh, I agree. Number of the Beast. One downside, I wish they would have had Total Eclipse on there like they did on the Japanese edition. and either added it on or replaced it instead of Gangland. And I only had a problem. I guess it wasn't a problem, but the sequencing is wrong because the album actually starts with Invaders. And, you know, side 2 is side 1. You know, it's, if you really realize it, the album starts with Invaders, Children of the Damned, The Prisoner, 22, and Number of the Beast is the 5th track. So it doesn't really matter. It's just, it's a great album. That Priest Screaming for Vengeance, again, a great album. Part of Screaming, though, some of it hasn't held up for me. And especially Pain and Pleasure, you know, sounds a little... My honest opinion just hasn't held up throughout the years, but it was Priest. I still think Another Thing Coming is just a fantastic song. The guitar solo is what made that song. Sort of reminds me of the equivalent. Later on, we'll visit the Scorpions' Love at First Sting, the guitar solo of Rock You Like a Hurricane. It's just it's just fantastic. So, all right, well, you know what? That's about it. Walt, I'm sorry, excuse me. How rude of me. Walt, have any input on Iron Maiden Number of the Beast?
This album is just, again, it's right up there. I couldn't have said it better myself. I mean, the whole album is just perfection. I mean, just the known tracks, the deep tracks, which aren't even deep tracks, they're known tracks, the imagery on the album cover, what was to come of the band on Peace of Mind, which comes next. And, yeah, I mean, it's the creme de la creme of 1982, in my opinion.
Yeah, if I had to add, the one thing I think that you can see with this list, the final one that we put together here, is that good, bad, or indifferent. I mean, this is some of the best stuff that was coming out at the time, and stuff that has really kind of stood the test of time. You know, whether you like every song or not, you know, which majority of them we do, I think it makes, you know, they made an impact for sure.
All right, well, let's get out of here. Metal Walt, Ian O'Rourke of the Central New York power band MOTORLORD. Guys, enjoy your weekend. Happy New Year. We'll talk real soon.
See you guys. See you, listeners. Happy New Year.
Everybody, we'll see you in the next year. Be safe. And like Verno says, keep it heavy.
Quick reminder, go to podchaser.com, leave a review. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, click up in the top right. Can't emphasize that enough. Visit us at the website, search us on Twitter. For my two brothers in metal, Metal Walt and Ian O'Rourke, I'm the Vernomatic. This is Metal Mayhem ROC. And as Ian says, keep it heavy. See you next week.
Metal for life.
Thanks for listening to Metal Mayhem ROC. Check out our websites at metalmayhemroc.com and metalforever.com for information on upcoming concerts, podcasts, archives, and all sorts of info. Please like, follow, and share with everyone, even your non-metal friends. Catch us next time on WLFE DB Radio.